Good evening, everybody, and welcome to HistoryAuthorTalks.com. We've got a wonderful show this evening. I'm very excited to have two very good friends of mine, I should say three very good friends of mine. We're going to be talking about the the Battle of Monmouth, which I've always felt is part of the Philadelphia campaign, but I know that it really is a campaign of its own. We are going to be introducing the authors in a moment. I want to let everybody know, first of all, that our authors' books are going to be available through the History Author Talks bookshop, which I will provide everybody with the link to the History Author Talks bookshop. And I will also invite everyone to use the chat feature to send questions to me during the show. The chat feature, which is at the bottom of your screen, where it just says that has that little chat icon, your questions will come to me, and we will have each of our authors give their presentations, and then we will go into our question and answer period, which we always feel is a good lively time to learn more. Before we start our show, I always ask a partner in history to join us to tell us a little bit about what is going on at a historic venue. Obviously, I try to make that appropriate, and what it's certainly most appropriate that tonight our partner in history will be a representative of the Friends of Monmouth Battlefield. So I'm very pleased to start us off with introducing you to John Resto, who is one of the historic interpreters with the Friends of Monmouth Battlefield. And I want to invite John to say a few words. So John, over to you.
Thank you, Rogers. Again, hello everyone, my name is John Resto. I am a trustee for the Friends of Monmouth Battlefield. I've been a trustee for 3 years. I'm starting my 4th year and been a volunteer probably over that. It just seems like I've been there longer than it has been, but Friends of Monmouth Battlefield was established in 1990 to help with restoration of the battlefield. Also, we provide walking tours, which we do every first Sunday of every month at 1:30 p.m. for free. We also do lectures in the museum when it is open. Unfortunately, it's closed right now. We are one of the main sponsors for the Battle of Monmouth reenactment, which unfortunately was canceled this year, but hopefully, crossing our fingers, next year everything will be back to normal, and we'll have that in June. We work with the staff at the Battle of Monmouth with the programming and with the walking tours. It's a great relationship that we have, that we're able to work together and bring these programs with them. Being able to use the visitor center for our lectures, and let's see what else we do. We have a gift shop in the visitor center that we run every Sunday from 1 to 4. Again, with the center being closed, but we have been setting up a little table outside every Sunday from about 1 to 3 with just information. We post some maps out there and just talk to people about the Battle of Monmouth. So I think it's a great organization. We're always looking for new members to help out. We are a not-for-profit organization, so everything we do comes from sales from our gift shop, donations, and also membership. One last thing, we help restore the Craig House, which is one of the 3 buildings on the battlefield that was there during the battle. It is something that we do, and again, we're not for profit, so every donation we get, a lot of it goes right to help restoring this home, so people can see what a farmhouse was like at that time, a colonial farmhouse and colonial farming. We do have a website, which Roger will post, Friends of Monmouth. It has lots of information. It has our schedule of events, information about the battlefield. Also has the maps in color from Fatal Sunday, which is the best book on the Battle of Monmouth. It is my Bible for walking tours and everything else. So definitely check it out. Check out the home, our webpage, and donate, and definitely become a member. It would be greatly appreciated. And thank you, Dr. Lender, for being here tonight. Thank you, Christian, for being here tonight. Roger, thank you for having me, and let the Friends of Monmouth be able to say a little bit about our organization.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. That was terrific. John, did I hear you that you are still giving tours?
We do, yeah. So this Sunday will be our November tour at 1:30. We do tours every month unless it's inclement weather. Very cold, snow, rain, but we do every month, and we're still outside. I don't know how much longer doing an information table. I was there this past Sunday and it was getting a little chilly, so not much longer, but yeah, we always do our tours. Check our Friends of Monmouth page on Facebook, or you could call the park office and they'll let you know if a tour is canceled or not.
Well, that's terrific. Excellent, John. Appreciate that so much.
Thank you, Roger.
So, as John mentioned, the Bible that he uses is Fatal Sunday, and Fatal Sunday is the book co-authored by Mark Edward Lender, our one of our guests tonight. Mark is a PhD in American history from Rutgers University, a professor emeritus of history from Keene University, from which he retired as vice president of academic affairs in 2011. He is the author or co-author of 11 books and many articles and reviews in early American social, military, and institutional history. Scholarship has won awards for writing and research, among them the Society of Military History's Distinguished Book of the Year Award and a Distinguished Writing Award from the U.S. Army Historical Foundation. He was the finalist for the 2017 George Washington Literary Prize. In 2018, he held the Research Fellowship at the Smith National Library at George Washington's Mount Vernon. Lender helped to establish the Crossroads of the American Revolution National Heritage Area as their first vice president, and he wrote a teacher training materials adopted by the Morristown National Historical Park. He's a recipient of the Richard J. Hughes Award, highest honor bestowed on the New Jersey Historical Commission for contributions to New Jersey history. He now lives in Richmond, Virginia with his wife, and Rutgers University librarian emerita and author Penny Booth Page. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce Mark Edward Lender. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, John, and thank you, Christian, for being here. John, thank you for the plug. The Bible, huh? High praise indeed. In case anybody wants a copy of the Bible, here it is, and let me hold it up. But it's called Fatal Sunday and the Politics of Battle. Actually, the full title is George Washington, the Monmouth Campaign and the Politics of Battle. And I think that subtitle pretty much tells you the direction I'm going to take tonight. The Monmouth Campaign, as Roger noted, sometimes is considered an offshoot or a continuation of the Philadelphia Campaign. You can argue that either way, but certainly in and of itself, it was an event we've got to pay attention to, because what became the Battle of Monmouth grew out of the Monmouth Campaign. It was for Washington and the Patriot cause generally. We've got to understand events as a campaign and then a battle on two fronts. When Washington led the army out of Valley Forge, chase Henry Clinton's army retreating across New Jersey from Philadelphia, it wasn't just Henry Clinton that Washington had in mind. Context is important here. And perspective is important here, not the perspective of you and I looking back to the revolutionary period from 2020. Context of late 1777 and early 1778. Washington, this is blunt, but he was a loser. He had a very, very difficult time in the field. He lost at Brandywine. He had a major portion of his army surprised at Paoli, the so-called Paoli massacre, when Washington's Continentals were surprised by No Flint Gray and an attack with cold steel. Washington's counterattack at Germantown failed. Philadelphia itself fell. You had a disastrous late 1777, not just for George Washington, but for the Middle States, or the Philadelphia campaign generally. Contrast that with events taking place several hundred miles to the north. While Washington struggled against Lord Howe and his brother William Howe, the Army commander, Lord Howe commanded the Royal Navy, supplying the Army up the Delaware River. To the north, Horatio Gates was winning the Battle of Saratoga. Now, I'm not going to get into the argument of how much credit does Horatio Gates deserve for the Saratoga victory. I know this is a hot button amongst a lot of historians, but nevertheless, the perspective of late 1777 was that Horatio Gates was deservedly an American national hero. Again, it's debatable today. People point to Benedict Arnold, they point to Phil Schuyler. Yes, everybody deserves some credit, but Gates was the man who actually accepted Burgoyne's surrender. Gates was the man who sent word of that victory to Philadelphia. Gates was the man who was acclaimed with hosannas, not just by his friends in the Continental Congress, but by Americans generally. He was legitimately applauded, lauded, whatever word you want to use. This was the man of the hour as far as many Americans were concerned. For Washington, this was a public relations disaster and actually a personal humiliation. He understood the comparisons between his performance around Philadelphia and Gates' performance at Saratoga were unflattering to him. There's just no question about it. There were those in Congress, those in the Army, who thought that Washington, frankly, was not up to the job after late 1777. And consider, again, look at it from 1777 and early 1778 as Washington struggled at Valley Forge. Why are generals hired? They're not hired just to hold off the enemy. They're not hired to lose. They're hired to win. They're hired to produce military and political results. Washington was doing neither. There is history to rely on here. The British Army, during the French and Indian War, went through commanding general after commanding general because the ministry in London, particularly when Pitt became prime minister, was not having it. They got rid of losers, and they got rid of loser after loser until they finally sent Jeffrey Amherst, who turned out to be a war. The precedent was there, and it was discussed on the floor of Continental Congress. They knew what Pitt had done. They knew what the fate of losing generals had been. That was the American context as well. Don't forget, that was a war that began over here. A good deal of it from a spark ignited by a very young George Washington. And the Americans understood what the history of losing British generals had been, and they had it very much in mind when they discussed George Washington's performance in 1777. This isn't just radical politicians. We've got to get rid of this good guys versus bad guys. These were patriots. While Samuel Adams, a radical firebrand, is criticizing George Washington, his son is an Army doctor right behind the lines at the Battle of Monmouth. James Lovell, fiery radical, maybe one of the most radical members of Congress, while he's criticizing, excoriating Washington. His son is a Continental officer, wounded, served gallantly throughout the war. These men were not people who had a personal animus against Washington, but they wanted someone to win the war, and they thought that person was great. When Washington led his army out of Valley Forge, he understood that his job was in jeopardy. He had held off most of these critics during the so-called Conway Cabal, and the Conway Cabal was real. The fate of Washington was very much in the balance in late 1777, early 1778. Washington knew that he needed results that would impress people in 1778 when he led his army out of Valley Forge, chased Henry Clinton across New Jersey. That, of course, began with the British evacuation of Philadelphia on the 18th of June, 1778. And Henry Clinton moved very slowly. People blame, oh, the weather was terrible weather. Yes, it was. The heat was awful. At one point, there was a reading in Philadelphia of over 100 degrees. There was a long stretch of 90-degree days. This was terrible weather. And torrents, thunderstorms, lightning bolts actually killed horses in Clinton's army. But it was fairly clear after a while that Clinton was not being held up unduly by the weather, the heat, or even Patriot harassment. Washington had dispatched different bodies of Continentals who teamed up with New Jersey militia, broke up bridges, they dropped trees across trails and roads, trying to slow down Clinton so that Washington could catch him. But Washington's intelligence, generally coordinated by New Jersey militia, Philemon Dickinson, pretty much concluded, and Washington was convinced, that Clinton was dawdling simply because he wanted nothing more than for Washington to catch up. Clinton, to redeem the humiliation of the loss of Philadelphia, wanted nothing more than for, he called it, a brush with Washington. What he wanted, if he couldn't get Washington to commit to a showdown battle, he wanted at least a chance to destroy a good part of the Continental Army. On the 28th of June, he got his chance. He got his chance, and there's the map. Thank you very much. On the 28th, the armies began to converge at Monmouth Courthouse. Washington had come south, he crossed at Courthouse Ferry, modern Lambertville, held an important conference of war on what do we do at Hopewell. And the Hopewell conference was important because you had a really divided opinion. You had Charles Lee, newly exchanged, the second in command of the Continental Army. He had been a prisoner of war for over a year. Wanted nothing to do with a pitched battle against the British. And most of the senior officers agreed with him. They knew that the Continentals were better after Valley Forge. They were better equipped. They were reorganized. Steuben had trained them. But how good were they? We really didn't know until the test of combat. On the other hand, Nathaniel Greene told Washington that it wasn't just about military victory. There was a political implication to this, that the army had been retrained, reorganized, and people expected something. You couldn't just allow the British to walk across an entire American state and not try to do something. It would have been a humiliation. Washington needed a victory. This is not the time or the place to go into the mechanics of the Battle of Monmouth. We can make a number of observations. The Continental Army proved better in the field than it had previously. Even the British acknowledged that these Continentals, they'd come a long way. And this is not just a couple of British officers mentioning it. Any number of them mentioned it. The Americans were ecstatic at their performance. One of the best letters we've got is from Alexander Hamilton, who was then one of young aide, one of Washington's favorite aides, writing to Elias Boudinot, New Jersey Politico, by then the Continental Army's commissary of prisoners, in charge of the welfare of American prisoners in British hands. Hamilton, writing to them, said, this is a virtual quote, "I never was pleased with our army before this day." And he meant it. Hamilton was finally pleased with the Continental Army. But what did they really do? Henry Clinton's job was to get his army back to New York City and to be redeployed. The French were now in the war. His army was going to be distributed to the American South, troops sent to the Caribbean. This was a world war now, and Great Britain had to distribute its forces in such a way that they could do the most with limited resources. That meant pretty much putting the war in the northern American colonies, not in hiatus, but it was going to become a secondary theater of operation. Big fighting would be in the American South, and to the Caribbean islands. There's even fighting a major siege going on in Gibraltar. A world war had grown from what had begun as a colonial rebellion. Clinton's orders were to get that army back to New York and make it ready to be redeployed. And he did that. The result of the combat at Monmouth was actually a tactical draw. The Americans did well. The American artillery, in the biggest artillery brawl of the war until the siege of Yorktown, went shot for shot in line of sight exchanges with the Royal Artillery. And they acquitted themselves very, very well. There was a lot for the Americans to be pleased with. In the field, the Americans understood what they had been taught, had digested what they had been taught by Steuben at Valley Forge. And there were instances when the Americans actually exchanged shot for shot with the best the British had. But it was a tactical draw. That was not what Washington needed. Washington needed, for political purposes, a major victory. And so what today we would call political spin, Washington's partisans won a victory. First of all, you had to get control of popular mood. What was popular opinion going to look like? What was political opinion going to look like after the battle? Alexander Hamilton, John Lawrence, the son of the president of the Continental Congress, swung into action. Henry Knox helped, other officers helped, writing letters to anybody who they thought would be influential at any level. Congress was absolutely astonished at the Continental performance. If you read the letters of delegates to the Continental Congress, you would think that Clinton had been destroyed. No, Clinton got his army back to New York following orders, and that army was duly redeployed. But the spin was successful. And there was part of the spin that I'm going to leave to Christian McBurney because he's done an entire book on this particular element of it. But part of it was getting rid of Charles Lee. Lee had fought well at Monmouth. He did probably as well as anybody could have under very adverse conditions. He prevented what could have been easily the destruction of a 3,500, 4,000 man vanguard. And for his trouble, he was court-martialed because he was insolent to Washington. Rumors of his misconduct circulated through the army, and those rumors were carefully crafted by Hamilton and the other spin doctors. Christian will go into that in some depth, I'm sure. Maybe we can even argue over it. Who knows? But you had, no, that's all right, Roger. We endorsed each other's books. It's okay. But you had a wonderful, masterful political campaign to give Washington the major victory he needed for political purposes. Washington came out of the Monmouth campaign as the man on the white horse. He was, at this point, not invulnerable to political pressure. He certainly listened to his political masters. but he was not going to be really faced with major opposition for the rest of the War for Independence. He was the American icon, out of criticism, but certainly unchallengeable as the safety of his job. So I began by saying the Monmouth campaign was a campaign on two fronts. Yes, campaign to fight the British Army, but also significantly a campaign to save George Washington's job. And we argue, we being my co-author Gary Wheeler Stone in Fatal Sunday, that the Monmouth campaign was the campaign that really put Washington over as the icon of the American. I think that's about 18 minutes on the head.
Excellent. Mark, I thank you very, very much. That was terrific. John Resto mentioned earlier that the maps that are inside Fatal Sunday are available on the Friends of Monmouth website. And I just wanted to show you all this little drop-down menu. This is the Friends of Monmouth website. And you can see University of Oklahoma and Mark and Gary were just very gracious in making these available for for everyone to see. So, I mean, Mark has given us a fabulous overview of what led up to the Battle of Monmouth and the significance of the Battle of Monmouth. But to really dig into the weeds and get into the battlefield, you've got all of these terrific maps from the book are on the website. But to really get a sense of what this drama was all about, it is, all of us cannot recommend this book enough. I mean, it's
say something about the maps, Roger, very quickly.
Yeah.
I know we've got time constraints, but Gary Wheeler Stone is an archaeologist, and he did these maps from the ground up based on the latest scholarship coming out of the archaeology on the battlefield of Monmouth. And the Friends of the Battlefield, as John can attest, have been instrumental in the support of that archaeological effort. These are not maps based on anybody's previous cartographical efforts. Gary did these things. They allowed us 15 or 17 maps in the book. There's a lot more posted on the Friends website. So I fully agree with you. If you want to get into the weeds, that's the website to do it.
Absolutely. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that. And I when I was wanting to bring Mark on tonight, Mark was a contributor to a book for which I was sort of producer of at the beginning of this year, called The 10 Key Campaigns of the American Revolution. And Ed Lengel, who's a renowned American Revolutionary War historian, and I came up with 10 of the top historians on each of the 10 key campaigns, and Mark was the obvious choice. So I wanted to do this show on the Battle of Monmouth, but I also, the obvious co-guest, if you will, to have tonight is Christian McBurney. Christian McBurney was raised in Kingston, Rhode Island, in a house that was built in 1809, and started writing actually back in high school, and wrote a history of Kingston while he was back in high school. So from high school, he stayed in Rhode Island, went to Brown University, 1981, and wrote 300-page undergraduate history thesis on, again, colonial South Kingston Planter Society. Graduated from New York University Law School in 1985, and as an attorney, he is with the law firm of Arent Fox, and lives in Kensington, Maryland, with his wife Margaret, where they raised 3 children. And he has been writing for a number of years. I think it's 9 books, Christian, at least that I certainly know.
Right, five Revolutionary War books.
Okay, great. Well, this particular book that he's going to talk to us about tonight is a perfect collaborative title, really, on some important figures in the Monmouth battle. So I'm pleased to have with us tonight Christian McBurney. Christian, over to you.
Great, thank you, Roger, and I'm glad to be here and honored to be with Mark after obviously his book was very helpful in doing mine. And I've met John before too, and I will say the Battle of Monmouth battlefield, I think, is one of the best preserved Revolutionary War battlefields in the country. So would encourage all of you to visit if you can. My book, as Roger said, is George Washington's Nemesis. It's the outrageous treason and unfair court-martial of Major General Charles Lee during the Revolutionary War. One of my prior books was called Kidnapping the Enemy, the Special Operations to Capture Major Generals Charles Lee and Richard Prescott. So combining the two, it's almost a biography of Charles Lee, who's definitely one of the most fascinating characters in the Revolutionary War on either side. What I'm trying to do with George Washington's Nemesis is to be objective. On the one hand, I argue about 1/3 of the book is about his treason. He was captured by the British November 1776, taken to New York. Within 2 months, he's writing a letter to addressed to General William Howe and Lord Admiral Richard Howe, explaining how they can defeat the American army as quickly as possible. He had decided that the Americans could not win, and that the American cause, they should basically save bloodshed, they should renounce the Declaration of Independence and return to British rule. So this is treason of a high magnitude. I think a lot of historians haven't taken it as seriously as it should have over the years. But I don't want to get too much into that. It wasn't discovered during his lifetime, so he could come back when he was finally exchanged for Richard Prescott as the number 2 general to George Washington. And he was in command of the troops at Monmouth. I will say, was Lee's treason as bad as Benedict Arnold? No. Arnold was paid approximately $1.2 million in current funds for turning traitor. He took up arms against the British, and he moved to England after the war. Lee did none of those things, but that doesn't mean you can't still be guilty of treason. Now, doesn't mean that Lee's all bad. As a matter of fact, he performed, when he was in the field for the American Army, he did very well. He was a little crazy off the field, but on the field, he performed well. And he did have the most experience, and he was the best educated of all the British generals, American generals. Now, as Mark said, he was given direction to attack the enemy as Clinton's troops lumbered across New Jersey. Now, it wasn't intended, the best evidence indicates it was not intended, that Lee was expected to get into a general action with Clinton. I think what Washington wanted was an attack on the British rear of Clinton's army, and to show that the American soldiers and all their training and all the supplies they had received from the various states had really been put to good use. So Lee did intend to attack. There were some delays, but once he saw the British army, there was really 3 parts. There was the rear guard in front, and 2,000 elite soldiers, the British Guard, Grenadiers, light infantry, about 3 miles away, and then another 3 miles was the main British force under Clinton. So he thought he could bag the rear guard, about 1,600 troops, and he wanted Anthony Wayne to keep the rear guard busy. He would circle some troops around the battlefield and trap them from behind. But unfortunately, Clinton altered his plans. He made a very bold move to turn his troops around and start charging after Lee's forces. And Cornwallis did as well, going towards the town of Freehold. that sent some panic in American lines. And the big problem here was, well, then you had Lee marching towards Freehold with Lafayette's brigade and another brigade. But the big problem was Charles Scott. He's really I had to say, and he's the bad guy of this story. He, without orders, ordered his brigade, the largest in the Continental Army, to turn around and retreat. And what's worse, he convinced William Maxwell, whose large brigade, New Jersey Continentals, very good troops. He also persuaded him to retreat through the woods without telling Lee. So before you know it, Lee has lost more than half of his forces. And then he has these elite British troops coming into Freehold. He's got a ravine behind him. He decides the best thing is to call a retreat. And that's a hard thing to do, to call a retreat during the battle. And he's a very proud man. He wanted to win the battle, but he, as Mark said, I'm persuaded as well, he saved a good portion of the American army by calling the retreat. And then he also set up a good delaying action, especially at a place called the Hedgerow, which was the main action in the battle. Very well fought by the Americans. And then the battle carries on, and Washington has some smaller counterattacks, which have been treated by historians as more important than they really deserve. I think the main action was really at the Hedgerow. But after the battle, Lee is charged with not attacking the enemy and an unfair retreat. At his court-martials, his main detractors were Charles Scott, who was most responsible for the retreat, Anthony Wayne, who was very confused, and the very young, inexperienced Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence. Now, in finding Lee guilty on all three, and also he was charged with insulting the commander, which I won't get into, but I think that was justified. But they convicted him of all three, not attacking the enemy and an unjustified retreat. And I think that's unfair, one of the most unfair court-martials in American history. But Lee had not, due to his impetuosity, not for the first time, made mistakes when he was off the battlefield. He had made it a contest between him and Washington. Let's see who's really right here, you or me. And Washington, even though he may not have been the best general on the battlefield, you know, let's look at Dwight D. Eisenhower. What was really important was someone who could keep the army together. That was really what was most important. And as long as the Continental Army was held together, the cause of independence had a good chance of succeeding. And Washington was that one indispensable man. Lee did not realize that, unfortunately, too late. Now, after the approval of the court-martial sentence by Congress, which was dramatic and close, Lee faced challenges to duel from John Lawrence. They actually fought a duel. Lee was slightly injured. Anthony Wayne and Baron von Steuben challenged him to duels. Anthony Wayne, as usual, Lee was accurate in his assessment, but too harsh. So with von Steuben, who actually has a statue at the battlefield, but Lee doesn't. I don't know why that is, John. Well, let's talk about that. But you give credit for Steuben because he did train the Continental troops and did a great job. But he said at the trial that von Steuben was just a distant spectator, which was true. He was. He didn't have much of a role in the battle. But von Steuben took it badly and wanted to challenge him, but fortunately they didn't have a duel. And Anthony Wayne, similarly, he laughed at Anthony Wayne constantly, asking for more troops, more troops. Wayne didn't really understand what was going on. That was true. But Anthony Wayne was also insulted, and he wanted to do a duel, but that was avoided as well. Now, this is the first book to delve into the details of the court-martial itself and put most of the blame where it belongs, with Charles Scott and William Maxwell. And so in refusing, I think, and Washington himself also, I think, doesn't look great in allowing this verdict to go through. Not his best moment. But as we said, most of the blame really goes to Lee for making it a political contest. And Mark mentioned the importance of politics in this presentation. And in this case, Lee made the mistake of not keeping it strictly to military grounds. If he had done that, then I think he would have been much better off, but instead he made it a political contest and only one of them could win. Now, Charles Scott is certainly an interesting character. He was a rough frontier leader from Virginia with a strong personality. Scott didn't want to be blamed for the loss, so he put the blame on Lee. He wrote a memorandum right after the battle blaming Lee. And he got to Washington first. But Scott's grudge against Lee really continued for many years after the war, because Lee did give some very dramatic testimony against Scott. Some of the most dramatic testimony was an aide who was of Lee, who was at Scott. This is, having this trial testimony is so interesting because we can rely on this transcript of the court-martial, and only 2 weeks after the battle, so it's a terrific resource. And the aide said that Scott said, "I'm looking at those troops over there and they're retreating. They're going back over the ravine." The aide said, "No, I don't think they are. I think they're going to Freehold. They're going to, attack the British troops there." And said, "No, I think they're retreating." And Scott ordered his troops to retreat and ordered Maxwell as well. Without the court martial, we probably would have never known those facts. But after the war, as an elder, I don't want to get too much into the transcript. It's a lot of fun. As a lawyer, it's very interesting to get into the back and forth. But after the war, as an elderly man in the early 19th century, Scott told a fanciful story about Washington at his first meeting during the Monmouth battle, swore at Lee. Of course, everyone knows about how Lee and Washington met. Washington got upset with him. It's actually the cover of the book. You can see this is from a painting at the Francis Tavern, not the usual Emanuel Leutze picture. You can see Washington on the white horse, of course, and Lee not looking down. In the Leutze picture, he's looking down, embarrassed. Here he's being firm and staring back. But here's the story. A friend asked if General Washington ever swore. Scott responded, "Yes, once. It was at Monmouth on a day that would have made any man swear. Yes, sir, he swore on that day till the leaves shook on the trees. Charming, delightful. Never have I enjoyed such swearing before or since. Sir, on that ever memorable day, he swore like an angel from heaven." Now, Scott wasn't even at the meeting. He was a half a mile away. His story is completely refuted by the court-martial testimony of aides who were there and present 2 weeks after the battle. But Scott's fanciful story was also in response to a friend trying to cure Scott of his bad habit of employing profanity. And the friend asked, "Oh, does Washington ever swear?" hoping to show that Scott would follow Washington's example of not swearing. But so Scott's story insulted Washington by saying he swore, which he didn't. Insulted General Lee, of course, because he deserved to be sworn at. And he insulted Christian religion because he said that angels swear. Angels don't swear at heaven. I'm sorry, Scott. But the book's, about 2/3 of the book is about the Battle of Monmouth, one long chapter and the court-martial, one long chapter on the Battle of Monmouth, 3 on the court-martial, and 2 following up. I'm going to end about a short bit about Alexander Hamilton. They hated each other. They were both very intelligent, obviously, and clashed. Some historians say that Hamilton lied on the stand, but actually on the key issue, did Lee have discretion to retreat if circumstances arose which would suggest it? He supported Lee. He told the truth. What happened was that Hamilton said that Lee had lost his composure during the battle. And John Lawrence said the same thing. That really infuriated Lee. He was a soldier of fortune. He had fought for kings in Europe. So this was crucial for him that he be respected as a good leader. So every time a witness came up, he would say, "Was I not the most composed person ever during the battle?" And everyone would say yes, including Henry Knox, who was a friend of Washington's, but supported Lee during this court-martial. There's also, Lee gave a very funny story about Hamilton, but I don't have time to go into that, maybe during Q&A. But Hamilton got the last laugh. Lee was suspended from the Army for 1 year. Now, most people think, 1 year, he was charged with not attacking the enemy, retreating in an unwarranted fashion. Shouldn't that be the firing squad? Yes, but he only got 1 year suspension. And most people think that was because no one in the court-martial really believed he should have been guilty of the first 2 charges, but he was guilty of insulting Washington. Now, the popular histories, you read all these popular histories, and Lee is the villain. He is to blame for the Continental Army not having more of success at Monmouth. I think that popular view has to change. Let's take, for example, the spectacular Broadway show, Hamilton. Great show, I love it, but doesn't treat Charles Lee very fairly. Let's see what it says here. Hamilton, instead of me, he promotes Charles Lee, makes him second in command. Lee, I'm a general, whee! Hamilton, yeah, he's not the choice I would have gone with. He shits the bed at the Battle of Monmouth. Washington, everyone attack. Lee, retreat. Washington, attack. Lee, retreat. Washington, what are you doing, Lee? Get back on your feet. Lee, but there's so many of them. Washington, I'm sorry this is not your speed. Hamilton, yes, sir. Washington, have Lafayette take the lead. Hamilton, yes, sir. Lawrence, 1,000 soldiers die in 100 degrees heat. Lafayette, as we snatch stalemate from the jaws of defeat. Hamilton, Charles Lee was left behind without a pot to piss in. So again, the popular historians are consistent with this version, perhaps not quite so colorful, and I do think that needs to change. And a good starting point would be to reevaluate Lee's court-martial conviction. In our country, fair trials are still an important value, and so is the judgment of history. And that's what we're doing now. Lee should be credited for possibly saving a good portion of the Continental Army at Monmouth. And John, I think we need to get a statue for Lee up at the state park there. Thank you.
That's terrific. Thank you, Christian. Great presentation. So I want to remind everybody that if you have questions for Mark and Christian, you can use the chat feature to send those questions to me, and I will then in turn forward them to or ask them of our guests. I actually would like to start first with Mark. There had been quite a few books on Monmouth prior to yours, Mark. How did you and Gary decide that, we really need to do something new? I mean, what was missing, and what led you to work on this project?
Growing up in New Jersey had a lot to do with it. Like Christian, I was a history buff as a youngster. And I didn't live all that far from the Monmouth battlefield. And even before it was as popular as it is today, I had a chance to walk around. And even on the parts of it that survive, aspects of the popular version of the battle didn't make a lot of sense. And that's when I met Gary Stone. The terrain simply did not favor Charles Lee on that morning of the 28th of June, 1778. And I think if you walk the grounds, as Gary and I did so frequently, and as I'm sure John does, you get a sense of anybody coming from the east, that is, out of freehold, chasing somebody who was going to the west. You got a height advantage. The advantage really lies with a large force coming from the east toward the west, and it's really not until you hit over the West Ravine, the last of the 3 ravines that mark the battlefield, and it's still very visible today. It's a mire. There is a bridge today on the county road where the bridge was pretty much back in 1778, and the high ground Perrines Hill behind that was a very solid defensible line. But until you hit that, which is where Lee was trying to go on his retreat, until you hit Perrines Hill, you were really at a disadvantage. And once we got that idea, then I think it was time to reinterpret what really happened. Because then, as Christian pointed out, Lee is not the bad guy. I mean, he conducted a retreat, kept that army together, or kept his section of the army together. As Christian pointed out, you had two major brigades that left, Scott's and Maxwell's. So Maxwell at least came back and swung around through the woods and ultimately rejoined. Scott kept going. And it was, frankly, kind of interesting as we began to track down the literary evidence and match it with the archaeological evidence that was beginning to come out of the ground, quite literally. And you can see where these different actions took place and looked at the archaeological remnants of what took place. It's very, very difficult to make a case that Lee was a bad guy in all of this. One of the really important things we found was that in counterattacking, Henry Clinton went a lot farther toward the main American position than most historians, or actually any historians before Fatal Sunday, had ever imagined. They got across. Lieutenant Colonel Monk, and leading the 2nd Battalion of British Grenadiers, forced the bridge. Some of them waded the mire, and they got across for maybe a minute before the largest American concentration of artillery of the war to that point simply slaughtered them. The archaeology dug up the impact of American grape and canister. Almost tell from the impact of the ammunition how far the British got, and the archaeological evidence supports absolutely the literary evidence, and it was really something to put the archaeology together with the archival research we were able to find and have them dovetail so nicely.
Mark, can I say something here?
Sure.
Yeah, 2 points. One, on Maxwell retreating as well. One thing that's kind of fun to know is that when Washington came to the battlefield, he saw these retreating troops. They were all of Maxwell's troops, and they were saying, "Oh, we don't know why we're retreating. It's terrible." They were Maxwell's troop. He was the one who retreated without orders, so it's kind of ironic. But one thing about the archaeology, to me, one of the keys to your book, the best points, was the action at the Point of Woods. That prior histories just did not pick that up.
Yeah.
And I think the archaeological study really helped to secure that. And
unfortunately, the Point of Woods hasn't survived. There was a railroad cut that went through, took out part of it. But we know the descriptions of what happened in the Point of Woods, for those who are listening or hearing this for the first time, was called that because it was a piece of terrain that jutted out from what would have been the British right, the American left, across the road that the British would have had to follow to get at the Americans. And it's kind of a point in its shape, heavily wooded. And as the British came on, as Washington and Lee finished their discussion, their argument, whatever you want to call it, Washington gave Lee a choice. Go back, reorganize the main army as it comes up, or stay here and fight the delaying action while Washington goes back. Washington had sent Anthony Wayne into that Point of Woods. Lee set up in back of the hedgerow that Christian had discussed. The British saw the American troops rallying at the hedgerow. They did not see Wayne going into the Point of Woods. So when the Grenadier Guards and the other Guards troops and the 17th Dragoons went in front of the Point of Woods, the Americans, we don't even know that there was an order to fire, but if you're an infantryman and you're under cover and you see the enemy going maybe 25 yards from you, it's point blank range, they just opened up and cut them to pieces. And they cut them to pieces for a gory minute or so, because British doctrine says if you're ambushed, you turn, you face the ambush, and you charge. And they overran the Point of Woods. The unbelievable descriptions of the fighting in the Point of Woods. I mean, one American was bayoneted 14 times and lived through it. You had Nathaniel Ramsey, brother of David Ramsey, one of the first real academic historians. He wasn't an academic, but it's that caliber of history of the American Revolution. Went down fighting, cutlass in hand, pistol discharged in his face, his powder burns. That's how close this fighting was. He was so heroic that Clinton, after the battle, he was captured, made sure he got medical attention and was treated very, very well by the British. Exchanged later. But this was just absolutely brutal fighting. And then at the hedgerow, as Christian pointed out, as the British closed with the hedgerow, you had Henry Clinton leading from the front with a very reluctant Cornwallis being towed along with him. I mean, swinging a sword, screaming, telling his guys, don't even form, just rush, get at these guys. And you had the hedgerow, it's reconstructed parts of it today, and you can see them. They were just stabbing bayonets through the brush at each other and blazing away as they were able to load. Didn't last all that long, 5, 6 minutes maybe, but that's a lot of time if you're getting shot at. Lee had to pull out. His position was being flanked. The withdrawal was orderly, and took his troops across the West Morass, that last ravine, and under the guns of Washington, who had established the army on Perrines Hill, exactly where Lee was trying to go in the first place. So you had these moments, these incidents of very, very intense combat, probably some of the most intense of the war. Christian also indicated that, pointed out that there were limited American counterattacks in the afternoon. Washington certainly did want to show that his guys could counterattack. They were limited. They were never meant to bring on a general engagement, but they were meant to show that the Americans could attack. The Americans made a great deal in that spin campaign I mentioned earlier about those limited afternoon counterattacks, which resulted in some pretty bloody fighting as well. But the real action was the morning battle.
Well, thank you. So we only have a time for a couple of questions here. I just wanted to mention that if we do not have time for your question, I have posted both Christian and Mark's websites. They have a contact page. You can get in touch with them, and I'm sure that they'll be happy to answer the questions that you have. But one of the questions that we have here, you alluded to, Mark, you said that Clinton actually managed to get a lot further than most historians had previously recognized. Would he have been able to press it further and actually crush the Continental Army? I mean, what had him pull back?
By the time he had brought up, and by the time poor Henry Monmouth was buried at a church there, just off the battlefield, he was the highest ranking British officer killed that day. By the time Monckton made that rush with the Grenadiers, Washington's people were on Perrine Heights and in a very good position. Washington would have loved nothing better than for a major British push across that ravine. But the fate of the Grenadiers proved to Clinton that it would have been a fool's. It would have been gallant, of course, but gallantry to the point of a fool's errand. No, he saw no point in it. If he couldn't get Washington to come to him, his orders, we have to keep reminding ourselves, his orders were to get that army intact back to New York to be redeployed. And if he'd had that army really cut up in a major thrust against Perrines Hill, it probably would have failed and failed catastrophically. Even had it succeeded, the British army would have been in no shape to get back to New York and follow his orders, or at least it would have been. If Washington had been forced to retreat at Monmouth, it would have done his reputation no good, but it would have saved the army. A British victory at Monmouth would have been costly beyond any real worth in a strategic sense. That army was needed elsewhere. and it was redeployed and fought elsewhere.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to everybody's questions. I will tell Christian and Mark that we do have some great audience questions, and I do hope that Steve Bennett and John Fabiano and Dave Button and Barry Snyder, Michael Hang, if you guys would indeed reach out to Christian and Mark, because they are great questions. We've run out of time, unfortunately. I make these 1-hour shows, and I hope that you will join us for the next show that I have listed. I'm taking a little bit of a hiatus here for a couple of weeks. The next show I have listed is actually on a Thursday night. That's Thursday, November 19th. We're going back in time a little bit here to before Valley Forge. And I have Michael C. Harris. I've asked Michael C. Harris to come back to talk about a little bit more about his book, Brandywine. And James R. McIntyre, who has written a new biography on Johann Ewald, who our historians will tell you we've learned a lot about the war and the Hessians through the writings of Johann Ewald, who was a Jaeger commander. I just wanted to show the cover of Mark's book, which he alluded to earlier. Or actually, I guess it was Christian who mentioned the Emanuel Leutze image of the Battle of Monmouth. Emanuel Leutze, who many of you probably know, is the artist who painted the famous Washington crossing the Delaware. This image is not as well known, obviously, as that particular image, but this also is an Emanuel Leutze painting, which is the cover of Mark and Gary's book, Fatal Sunday. So I urge you all to go to historyauthortalks.com. You'll see links to the bookshop there where you can buy our authors' books and other books on the American Revolution. I would like very much to thank our authors, Christian McBurney and Mark Lender, who gave us some of their time this evening, and our partner in history, John Resto from the Friends of Monmouth Battlefield. And I would like to thank all of you for spending a little time with us this evening, and we hope to see you on Thursday, November 9th. If I do book another show, you'll get an email from me and I'll post it on the History Author Talks Facebook page. But I'm lining up some other great shows coming up after that. So I thank you all, and I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Roger.
You bet. Take care.